The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the annual summer garden party was in full swing. Mrs. Emmeline Carter, whose organizational abilities were legendary and whose attention to detail bordered on the obsessive, surveyed her domain with the satisfaction of a general reviewing successful troops. The white tablecloths fluttered gently in the warm breeze. The Victoria sponge stood at perfect attention beside the strawberry tarts, and the tea-urns gleamed like burnished silver in the dappled light filtering through the ancient elm trees. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wooden bench near the parish notice board, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a delicate baby shawl. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in counting stitches and managing her pale blue wool. In reality, her keen eyes missed nothing of the small drama unfolding around the refreshment table, where Mrs. Carter was making final adjustments to a particularly elegant place setting that stood apart from the others. The china was exquisite, thin porcelain decorated with trailing ivy in shades of green and gold, clearly the best pieces from Mrs. Carter's collection. Beside the cup and saucer sat a small folded card bearing the name Mr. Julian Drake in Mrs. Carter's careful copperplate handwriting. A separate silver teapot, tied with a green ribbon to match the china pattern, waited nearby with what Miss Marple's experienced nose detected as lapsang souchong, a sophisticated choice that spoke of careful consideration for the guest's preferences. He specifically mentioned in his letter that he preferred a smoky tea. Mrs. Carter was explaining to her niece Lorna, a sensible young woman of 25 who had been pressed into service, arranging cucumber sandwiches. It shows attention to detail, don't you think? People remember such thoughtfulness. Lorna, whose experience of the world extended somewhat beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead, murmured diplomatically, "I'm sure he'll appreciate the effort, Aunt Em." Mr. Julian Drake had become something of a sensation in the village since his letter of introduction had arrived 3 weeks prior. He had purchased the old mill house, a charming but somewhat neglected property on the outskirts of the village, and had already made generous promises regarding donations to the Church Restoration Fund and the village library. More intriguingly, he was a bachelor of independent means who had expressed a desire to become actively involved in village life. A combination of circumstances that had set every matchmaking instinct in St. Mary Mead aquiver with anticipation. "A gentleman of refinement," Mrs. Carter had announced after receiving his initial correspondence. "His handwriting alone speaks of proper education, and his manner of expression is most considerate. We shall make him feel thoroughly welcome." As 4 o'clock approached, the time specifically mentioned in Mrs. Carter's invitation, the assembled villagers found their attention increasingly drawn to the road that led from the old mill house. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, consulted his pocket watch with the precision of a man accustomed to keeping appointments. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose opinions on punctuality were as fixed as her views on proper dress, began to emit small sounds of disapproval. "Londoners," muttered Captain Weatherby, a retired military man whose faith in civilian timekeeping had been permanently damaged by years of service. "No concept of precision, probably stopped at some public house along the way." Miss Marple's knitting paused for just a moment as she observed the interplay of personalities around her. There was Mrs. Bantry, whose curiosity about the mysterious Mr. Drake had been barely contained for weeks. Young Dr. Haydock, who seemed unusually interested in the proceedings for a man typically absorbed in his medical practice, and Mrs. Price Ridley, whose disapproval of tardiness was competing visibly with her eagerness to meet a potential new member of village society. At 4:20, when conversation had begun to flag and Mrs. Carter's smile was showing signs of strain, a bicycle bell announced the arrival of Tommy Fletcher, the telegram boy. He skidded to a halt beside the refreshment table with the dramatic flair that only a 14-year-old could muster, his red hair disheveled and his face flushed with the importance of his errand. "Telegram for Mrs. Carter," he announced, producing a yellow envelope with a flourish. Just came through from the post office." A small silence fell over the gathering. Telegrams in St. Mary Mead were rare enough to command attention, and their arrival during social occasions was generally considered ominous. Mrs. Carter accepted the envelope with a sort of smile that indicated she was determined to maintain her composure regardless of the contents. She opened it with the butter knife, a practical woman who believed in using whatever tool came to hand, and read the brief message aloud. "Regret unable to attend. Unavoidable business has arisen. Will call upon you soon. J. Drake." "Business," repeated Mrs. Price Ridley with the tone of voice she typically reserved for discussing unseemly topics. "On a Saturday afternoon. Most irregular." "Perhaps there's been an emergency," suggested Mrs. Bantry charitably. "Some urgent matter requiring his immediate attention." Mrs. Carter, demonstrating the resilience that had made her a pillar of village society, smiled brightly and began to remove the special place setting. "Well then, we shall simply have to enjoy ourselves without Mr. Drake's company. There will be other opportunities, I'm sure." Miss Marple watched this small drama with the attention she might have given to a particularly complex knitting pattern. Something about the situation struck her as odd, though she couldn't immediately identify what troubled her. Perhaps it was the timing. A telegram arriving so close to the appointed hour suggested last-minute circumstances rather than long-standing obligations. Or perhaps it was simply that in her experience, people who took the trouble to specify their tea preferences were not typically the sort to cancel social engagements lightly. The party continued with the determined cheerfulness that characterizes such gatherings when minor disappointments must be overcome. Conversation flowed, tea was poured, and the cucumber sandwiches disappeared with satisfying efficiency. It might have remained nothing more than a small social setback if P.C. Bert Archer hadn't appeared at the garden gate precisely at 5:30, his usually cheerful face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Carter," he said, removing his helmet with the careful respect due to both his position and the solemnity of his errand. "But I wonder if Dr. Haydock might be available. There's been an incident at the old mill house." Dr. Haydock immediately set down his teacup. "What sort of incident, Archer?" "It's Mr. Drake, sir, the gentleman who's taken the house. Mrs. Pembridge from Rose Cottage was walking her dog along the mill stream when she noticed the front door standing wide open. She called out, thinking perhaps he'd stepped into the garden, but when there was no answer, she took the liberty of looking inside." The constable paused, clearly struggling with the delicacy of his report. "She found him in the study, sir. Dead. And from the look of things, well, it doesn't appear to have been natural causes." The effect of this announcement was immediate and profound. Teacups rattled against saucers, and Mrs. Price Ridley actually gasped aloud, a sound that would have been remarkable under any other circumstances. Mrs. Carter, still holding the folded telegram, stared at the constable as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "Dead?" she repeated faintly. "But that's impossible. He sent this telegram just an hour ago." Miss Marple's knitting had gone completely still in her lap. Her mild blue eyes were fixed thoughtfully on the telegram in Mrs. Carter's hand, and those who knew her well might have recognized the particular quality of attention that indicated her mind was already working through possibilities and implications. "If I might suggest," she said gently, rising from her bench with the careful movements of age, "it would perhaps be wise to preserve that telegram, Mrs. Carter. In circumstances such as these, even the smallest details can prove significant." As the garden party dissolved into clusters of shocked conversation and urgent consultation, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with deliberate care. The afternoon that had begun with such promise of ordinary social pleasure had taken a turn that she recognized all too well. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that the most interesting puzzles often began with the simplest questions. Why would a man send a telegram declining an invitation he would never be able to attend? And what sort of unavoidable business could possibly require such permanent attention. The guest who never came had, it seemed, left behind a mystery that would require all of Miss Marple's considerable understanding of human nature to unravel. The shocking news of Mr. Julian Drake's death spread through the remaining garden party, guests like ripples across a disturbed pond, each person's reaction revealing as much about their character as their immediate theories about the tragedy. Mrs. Price Ridley, her usual composure cracking just enough to reveal the avid curiosity beneath, immediately declared that she had always suspected something unsavory about a gentleman who purchased property, sight unseen, while Captain Weatherby began constructing elaborate scenarios involving London criminals and gambling debts with the systematic precision of his military background. Dr. Haydock departed swiftly with P.C. Archer, his medical bag in hand, and his face grave with professional duty, leaving behind a cluster of villagers whose shock was rapidly transforming into the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies unexpected drama in small communities. Mrs. Carter, still clutching the telegram that had arrived with such unfortunate timing, seemed unable to process the contradiction between the polite message declining her invitation and the brutal reality that its sender was already beyond all earthly engagements. Her niece Lorna, demonstrating the practical sensibility that had made her invaluable during the party preparations, gently guided her aunt toward a chair while observing with quiet intelligence that something about the telegram itself seemed wrong, though she could not immediately articulate what troubled her about its tone and phrasing. The arrival of Inspector Craddock's official police car within the hour confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect, that Mr. Drake's death was no accident or natural occurrence, and the sight of the familiar inspector's grim expression as he disappeared into the old mill house sent a collective shiver through the village that had nothing to do with the evening's cooling air. Dr. Haydock returned from his examination with information that only deepened the mystery, confiding to his wife and, inevitably, to Mrs. Bantry during an urgent telephone consultation that Mr. Drake had been struck down with what appeared to be a heavy brass candlestick from his own mantelpiece, and that the study showed clear signs of having been searched, though nothing of obvious value seemed to have been taken. Most puzzling of all was the timing, for Dr. Haydock's professional assessment placed the death between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which meant that Mr. Drake had been dead or dying at precisely the moment his telegram was being delivered to Mrs. Carter's expectant gathering. This crucial detail about the timing sent Mrs. Bantry into a flutter of detective enthusiasm as she immediately grasped the impossibility of a dead man sending telegrams and began pestering everyone within reach about who might have sent the message and why they would want to create such an elaborate deception. Tommy Fletcher, the telegram boy, found himself the center of unwanted attention as various villagers attempted to extract every detail about the message's delivery, though his account remained frustratingly straightforward. The telegram had arrived at the post office from Much Benham at 4:10, been processed immediately by Mrs. Henderson at the telegraph desk, and delivered to the garden party within 20 minutes, exactly as routine dictated. Mrs. Symes at the post office, when pressed by the more persistent gossips, maintained her professional discretion with the sort of stubborn dignity that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share, though she did allow that the telegram had come through the usual channels and been dispatched with proper efficiency. Young Lorna's observation about the telegram's peculiar phrasing proved particularly astute when she mentioned to Dr. Haydock that Mr. Drake's previous correspondence had been notably elegant and formal, with careful attention to proper grammar and courteous expression, making the abrupt, almost rude brevity of "unavoidable business has arisen" seem entirely out of character for a gentleman who had taken such pains to specify his tea preferences and express genuine enthusiasm for village life. This discrepancy struck several listeners as significant, though none could quite explain why a forged telegram would be written in a different style from its supposed author's usual correspondence, unless the forger was either unfamiliar with Mr. Drake's writing habits or working under considerable pressure and time constraints. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had positioned herself with characteristic unobtrusiveness near the edge of these various conversations, her knitting providing the perfect cover for her careful observation of how each person reacted to the unfolding drama. She noted Mrs. Price Ridley's almost eager embrace of the most scandalous theories, Captain Weatherby's tendency to impose military logic on civilian mysteries, and Mrs. Carter's genuine distress at finding herself inadvertently connected to such a sordid affair through her innocent invitation. Most interestingly, she observed how quickly the various theories began to crystallize around the speaker's own prejudices and preconceptions, with Mrs. Price Ridley immediately suspecting the new gardener based purely on his unfamiliar face, while Captain Weatherby's London criminal theory reflected his deep suspicion of urban influences on rural tranquility. As the evening shadows lengthened and the official police presence established a perimeter around the old mill house, the easy villagers reluctantly dispersed to their homes, but their conversations continued over dinner tables and across garden fences, each retelling adding fresh embellishments and increasingly dramatic interpretations. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind working through the curious contradiction at the heart of the case. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create the illusion that Julian Drake was alive and declining a social engagement when he was already dead, suggesting not just a murderer, but a murderer with an intimate understanding of village social customs and the importance of maintaining proper appearances. The false telegram revealed a killer who was not content simply to commit violence, but felt compelled to manipulate the subsequent investigation by controlling when and how the crime would be discovered, indicating a mind that was both calculating and familiar with the rhythms of St. Mary Mead's daily life. The morning after the shocking discovery brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, with the early sun casting familiar shadows across the village green as if nothing had changed, though the police tape fluttering around the old mill house served as a stark reminder that their peaceful world had been shattered by violence. Miss Marple began her day with characteristic deliberation, choosing to water her roses before breakfast while observing the unusual activity that had already begun in the village, noting how Mrs. Price Ridley emerged from her cottage earlier than usual to collect her milk, clearly hoping to encounter someone with fresh information about the investigation. After a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, Miss Marple set out on what appeared to be her routine morning walk, but which was actually a carefully planned circuit of the village designed to gather information through the seemingly innocent conversations that were her specialty. Her first stop was Mrs. Bantry's garden, where she found her friend deadheading the late roses with the distracted air of someone whose mind was entirely occupied with the previous day's drama, and it was here that Miss Marple learned her first significant detail when Mrs. Bantry mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had seen a van from Hartwell and Sons, the London antique dealers, leaving the old mill house around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon, which she had initially dismissed as simply Mr. Drake receiving furniture, but now wondered if it might be connected to his death. From the post office, where Miss Marple stopped to purchase stamps with her usual unhurried manner, she extracted far more valuable information from Mrs. Symes, whose professional discretion was gradually worn down by gentle questions about the efficiency of the telegram service and sympathetic observations about the burden of handling such unusual circumstances. Mrs. Symes eventually revealed that the telegram from Much Benham had been dictated over the telephone by a woman's voice, rather crisp and businesslike, quite different from the cultured tones of Mr. Drake's previous correspondence, and this detail immediately struck Miss Marple as significant, since it meant that either Mr. Drake had employed a secretary to send his regrets, or someone else entirely had sent the message in his name. The choice of Much Benham as the sending location also seemed deliberate, for it was far enough from St. Mary Mead to avoid recognition of the caller's voice, while still being close enough to ensure timely delivery, suggesting someone with knowledge of both locations and their postal connections. At Lumley's General Store, Miss Marple encountered Captain Weatherby expounding his theories about international conspiracies to anyone who would listen, but more usefully, She learned from Mr. Lumley himself that Mr. Drake had been a particular customer who ordered expensive items and seemed to be settling in comfortably, though there had been something mysterious about his habits. Mr. Lumley mentioned seeing an unfamiliar dark car parked near the old mill house on several evenings during the past week, always driven by a young man in a dark suit who seemed to be waiting for someone, and this pattern of secretive meetings added another layer of intrigue to Mr. Drake's brief residence in the village. Miss Marple also learned that Hester Rouse, the charwoman who cleaned the old mill house twice weekly, had mentioned finding a silver-framed photograph of a determined-looking woman hidden behind some books in the study, but when she had glanced in the next day, the photograph had disappeared, suggesting that someone had been removing personal items either before or after the murder. The most disturbing information came from her conversation with young Lorna Carter, who had spent a sleepless night worrying about her aunt's distress and had been analyzing every detail of Mr. Drake's previous correspondence in an attempt to understand what had happened. Lorna's observation that Mr. Drake's earlier letters had quoted poetry and demonstrated genuine literary sensibility made the telegram's abrupt, businesslike tone seem even more suspicious, as if it had been composed by someone trying to imitate formal language without understanding the subtleties of educated expression. Inspector Craddock's brief visit to Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon confirmed many of her suspicions while adding new puzzles, for his investigation had revealed that Mr. Drake's background was remarkably thin for a gentleman of supposed independent means, with recent bank accounts and minimal personal history that suggested either a man starting fresh or someone living under an assumed identity. As evening approached and the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with her knitting, her mind working through the various threads of information she had gathered throughout the day. The pattern that emerged was troubling, for it suggested that Julian Drake had not been the simple gentleman seeking rural retirement that he had appeared to be, but rather someone with connections to London's more sophisticated criminal elements, possibly involved in the antique trade or other businesses that required discretion and secrecy. The telegram sent by a woman from Much Benham indicated careful planning and local knowledge, while the mysterious visitors in the removed photograph suggested that Drake's death was connected to his hidden past rather than any village grudges or random violence. Most significantly, the killer had demonstrated intimate knowledge of village customs and timing, suggesting either a local person with connections to Drake's secret life or an outsider who had studied St. Mary Mead carefully enough to manipulate its social rhythms for their own purposes. And Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the murderer was someone who had been watching and waiting for the right moment to strike, using the garden party as the perfect cover for their carefully planned crime. Inspector Craddock's methodical investigation quickly produced what appeared to be a satisfactory resolution to the mystery, focusing attention on Albert Tressida, a weathered handyman in his 50s who had been employed by Mr. Drake to repair the mill wheel and clear the overgrown garden paths around the old mill house. Tressida had been seen leaving the property around 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the murder, carrying his tools and clearly agitated, muttering angrily about payment disputes and gentlemen who treated working men as fools to be cheated without consequence. Mrs. Pembridge, whose cottage provided an excellent view of the mill stream, testified that she had heard raised voices from the direction of the study, though her aging hearing made it difficult to distinguish exact words, and she had observed Tressida's departure with the sort of attention that comes naturally to those who live alone and find entertainment in their neighbors' affairs. The case against Tressida seemed to strengthen considerably when the inspector's search of his modest lodgings revealed a blood-stained shirt hastily concealed beneath a pile of dirty clothes, along with nearly £60 in cash that represented far more money than a man of his circumstances would normally possess, particularly given his landlady's testimony that he had been complaining bitterly about being short of funds just days before the murder. Tressida's own account of the afternoon proved confused and contradictory under questioning, claiming first that he had left the old mill house early because Mr. Drake was absent, then admitting to a disagreement about payment, and finally insisting that he had been paid in full and departed on amicable terms, though he could not satisfactorily explain either the blood on his clothing or the sudden appearance of substantial cash in his possession. The physical evidence appeared equally damning when constables discovered a heavy wooden mallet near the mill stream, the sort commonly used by gardeners for driving stakes, though it was not the brass candlestick confirmed as the actual murder weapon. More significantly, a large muddy boot print found just outside the study window matched the size and type of Tressider's work boots, though the window itself showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer had approached the house through the garden rather than using the front door. Dr. Haydock's examination confirmed that the victim had been struck multiple times with considerable force, consistent with the strength possessed by someone accustomed to physical labor, and the angle of the wound suggested an attacker of Tressider's approximate height and build. Village opinion, led by Mrs. Price Ridley's authoritative pronouncements and enthusiastically supported by Captain Weatherby's conviction that working-class resentment inevitably led to violence, quickly crystallized around Tressider's guilt, with most residents expressing relief that the mystery had been solved so efficiently and that the threat to their peaceful community had been identified and contained. The narrative satisfied their need for simple explanations. A rough man driven to violence by perceived injustice, a crime of passion rather than calculated malice, something that could be understood and therefore dismissed as an aberration rather than a reflection of deeper dangers lurking beneath their tranquil surface. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the very neatness of the case against Tressider, recognizing from long experience that the most obvious explanations were often the most deceptive, particularly when they confirmed existing social prejudices and allowed everyone to sleep more comfortably in their beds. Her careful observation of the handyman during his occasional appearances in the village had suggested a man who was certainly rough around the edges and prone to drink when frustrated, but who possessed the fundamental honesty that often characterized those who earned their living through honest physical labor, and she found it difficult to reconcile this impression with the calculated deception required to arrange the false telegram that had delayed discovery of the crime. More significantly, her deep understanding of human psychology told her that a man like Tressider, if genuinely driven to violence by righteous anger over unpaid wages, would be far more likely to act in the heat of passion and flee immediately afterward, rather than engaging in the elaborate charade of creating alibis and misdirecting the investigation through sophisticated communications requiring advanced planning and local knowledge. The telegram itself continued to puzzle her most of all, for its timing and content suggested a level of premeditation that seemed entirely inconsistent with Tressider's straightforward, if volatile, character, and she wondered why a man who had just committed murder in a fit of rage would take the trouble to telephone Much Benham and arrange for a message that would only delay the discovery of his crime by a few precious hours. The woman's voice that had dictated the telegram also struck her as significant, for while it was theoretically possible that Tressider had enlisted female assistance in his deception, Miss Marple's extensive experience suggested that such partnerships were exceedingly rare in crimes of passion and far more common in carefully premeditated affairs involving complex financial or personal motives that extended well beyond simple disputes over wages and working conditions. As Inspector Craddock prepared to charge Tressider with murder, confident that the physical evidence and witness testimony provided a compelling case for the prosecution, Miss Marple found herself in the uncomfortable position of doubting the official investigation without possessing sufficient concrete evidence to support her growing conviction that the real killer remained at large. Someone far more clever and dangerous than the obvious suspect. Someone who understood the village's social dynamics well enough to direct suspicion toward the most convenient target. Miss Marple's discomfort with the seemingly straightforward case against Albert Tressider crystallized into genuine concern when Inspector Craddock, with the satisfied air of a man who had tied up loose ends efficiently, announced his intention to formally charge the handyman by week's end. a decision that met with universal approval from the village worthies who preferred their mysteries solved quickly and their social order restored without prolonged uncertainty. The evidence appeared overwhelming to everyone except Miss Marple, whose long experience had taught her that the most obvious solutions were often the most deceptive, particularly when they confirmed existing prejudices and allowed respectable people to sleep peacefully in their beds, knowing that violence had been contained within predictable social boundaries. When she gently suggested to Inspector Craddock that it might be worthwhile to examine the old mill house once more before closing the case, he agreed with the weary patience of a professional who respected her insights even when they complicated his work, and Miss Marple found herself accompanying Hester Rouse, the charwoman, on what appeared to be a simple errand to retrieve cleaning supplies, but was actually a carefully planned opportunity to observe details that others had overlooked in their rush to build a case around physical evidence and obvious motives. The study at the old mill house told a story far more complex than the official investigation had recognized, beginning with the tea service that remained exactly as it had been found after the murder. 2 cups instead of 1, both bearing the residue of what had clearly been an afternoon social call rather than a business meeting between employer and workman. 1 cup showed the faint crescent of lipstick in a shade that Miss Marple's observant eye recognized as far more fashionable than anything typically worn by the village ladies, while the other contained the dried remnants of tea leaves that had been allowed to steep too long, suggesting a conversation that had continued well beyond the normal duration of polite refreshment. Most significantly, the small silver tray bore the remnants of lemon slices and sugar, prepared with obvious care for a lady caller, despite Mr. Drake's well-documented preference for taking his lapsang souchong, without any additions that might compromise its distinctive smoky flavor, a contradiction that spoke of elaborate preparation for a specific guest whose preferences differed markedly from his own. Hester Rouse, whose sharp eyes missed little in her professional domain, confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions when she mentioned that Mr. Drake had specifically requested the lemon and had instructed her to use the best china for a 3 o'clock appointment. Unusual behavior for a man who had previously shown little interest in formal entertaining and had seemed content with simple, solitary meals since taking residence in the village. The ashtray on the writing desk contained the remnants of cigarettes that bore no resemblance to the rough tobacco favored by working men like Tressida, but rather the fine aromatic ash of expensive foreign cigarettes that suggested a visitor of sophisticated tastes and considerable means, someone who moved in circles far removed from the honest labor disputes that the official investigation had assumed motivated the crime. Even more telling was the faint but unmistakable scent of lavender polish that clung to the brass candlestick that had been moved from the mantelpiece to the dining room sideboard, a detail that spoke of careful cleaning and rearrangement after the murder, the sort of meticulous attention to appearances that was entirely inconsistent with Tressida's straightforward character and his likely behavior following a crime of passion. The psychological impossibility of Tressida's guilt became even more apparent when Miss Marple considered the sophisticated deception required to arrange the false telegram, a scheme that demanded not only advanced planning and local knowledge, but also the sort of calculating intelligence that could orchestrate multiple layers of misdirection while maintaining an appearance of innocence throughout the subsequent investigation. A man like Tressida, driven to violence by righteous anger over unpaid wages, would be far more likely to strike in the heat of passion and flee immediately, rather than pausing to clean evidence, rearrange furniture, and telephone Much Benham to dictate a message that would delay discovery of his crime by precious hours that he could have used to establish an alibi or simply disappear entirely from the district. The very sophistication of the deception, pointed toward a killer who understood not only the rhythms of village life, but also the psychology of criminal investigation, someone capable of directing suspicion toward the most obvious target while remaining above suspicion themselves through careful manipulation of appearances and expectations. Most intriguingly, Hester's casual mention of the silver-framed photograph that had been hidden behind books in the study depicting what she described as a determined-looking woman with strong features rather than conventional beauty, took on new significance when considered alongside its mysterious disappearance between her visits to the house, suggesting a killer who was not content merely to commit violence but felt compelled to erase specific traces of Mr. Drake's personal history. This detail, overlooked by the official investigation in their focus on physical evidence and obvious motives, spoke to Miss Marple of deeply personal stakes that extended far beyond simple financial disputes, hinting at connections to Drake's mysterious past that someone was desperate to keep hidden even after his death. As evening shadows lengthened across the mill stream and the village settled into its accustomed quiet, Miss Marple walked slowly home with the growing conviction that the real murderer remained at large, someone clever enough to exploit the natural human tendency to seek simple explanations while concealing their own sophisticated motives behind a carefully constructed facade of innocence that had successfully deceived everyone except a gentle old lady whose understanding of human nature had been refined by decades of quiet observation. Inspector Craddock's return to the old mill house the following morning, accompanied by Miss Marple's gentle suggestion that certain details deserved closer examination, revealed a story far more complex than the straightforward case against Albert Tressida had suggested, beginning with the elegant tea service that remained exactly as it had been discovered after the murder, bearing unmistakable evidence of an afternoon social call between Mr. Drake and a lady of refined tastes and careful habits. The delicate china cups, one bearing the faint crescent of expensive lipstick in a fashionable shade rarely seen in St. Mary Mead, sat alongside a silver tray that held the remnants of lemon slices and refined sugar, prepared with obvious care for a guest whose preferences differed markedly from Mr. Drake's well-documented habit of taking his lapsang souchong without any additions that might compromise its distinctive smoky flavor. Most significantly, the ashtray contained the ash of expensive foreign cigarettes, the sort favored by sophisticated London society rather than the rough tobacco that working men like Tressida might afford, while the entire study bore the faint but unmistakable scent of lavender polish that had been applied with meticulous care to surfaces that showed no signs of the violent struggle one might expect from a crime of passion committed by an angry laborer demanding his wages. The revelation that this mysterious lady caller had been expected and carefully prepared for emerged through Hester Rouse's reluctant admission that Mr. Drake had specifically requested the best china and the lemon slices for a 3 o'clock appointment. Unusual behavior for a man who had previously shown little interest in formal entertaining and had seemed content with simple, solitary meals since taking residence in the village. Even more telling was her observation that the brass candlestick, now confirmed as the murder weapon, had been moved from its usual place on the mantelpiece to the dining-room sideboard after being polished with the same lavender-scented preparation, suggesting a killer who possessed not only the calculating intelligence to plan an elaborate deception, but also the deeply ingrained domestic instincts that compelled them to clean and tidy even in the aftermath of violence. This psychological profile was entirely inconsistent with Tressida's straightforward character and his likely behavior following a crime committed in the heat of righteous anger over unpaid wages, pointing instead toward someone whose response to crisis was to impose order and maintain appearances through careful attention to domestic details. The investigation's focus began to shift toward the village's more respectable residents when Miss Marple's careful inquiries revealed that Mrs. Carter's connection to the murdered man extended far beyond the simple social acquaintance she had initially claimed, having corresponded with him for several months before his arrival through what she had described to her niece Lorna as mutual friends in London's cultural circles. This extended relationship explained not only Mrs. Carter's unusual attention to Drake's preferences and her elaborate preparations for his comfort at the garden party, but also her increasingly agitated behavior following the murder, as Lorna confided her growing concerns about her aunt's emotional state and the mysterious telephone calls she had been making at odd hours, speaking in hushed tones about arrangements and meetings that she refused to explain to anyone in the household. Most disturbing was Lorna's discovery that her aunt had been receiving letters that she immediately burned after reading, behavior that suggested involvement in affairs far more complex than simple village social planning and hinted at secrets that someone was desperate to keep hidden even after Drake's death. The sophisticated nature of the deception required to arrange the false telegram became even more apparent when Mrs. Symes at the post office, her professional discretion gradually worn down by Miss Marple's gentle persistence, revealed that the woman who had dictated the message from Much Benham had displayed an unusual familiarity with postal procedures, specifying the exact timing required for delivery to coincide with the garden party's peak hours, when the delay would be most effective in misdirecting the investigation. This level of detailed planning spoke to someone with intimate knowledge not only of village social customs, but also of the postal system's operational requirements, suggesting either professional experience or careful advanced research that pointed toward premeditation of the most calculating kind, entirely inconsistent with the spontaneous violence that characterized crimes of passion like the one attributed to poor Tressida. The caller's voice, described as crisp and businesslike with the sort of educated precision that came from years of managing complex arrangements, belonged to someone accustomed to giving instructions and ensuring their careful execution, traits that were becoming increasingly familiar to Miss Marple as she observed the various personalities within the village's social hierarchy. Dr. Haydock's medical observations added another layer to the mystery when he mentioned, in response to Miss Marple's casual inquiry about Mr. Drake's general health, that his new patient had seemed remarkably fit for a man supposedly recovering from nervous exhaustion, displaying none of the typical symptoms that usually accompanied such circumstances, while possessing several small scars on his hands that suggested familiarity with tools or machinery, inconsistent with his claimed background as a gentleman of leisure living on inherited investments. These physical inconsistencies, combined with Inspector Craddock's discovery that Drake's documentation was remarkably thin for a man of supposed independent means, painted a picture of someone living under a carefully constructed false identity, whose real history was sufficiently dangerous or compromising that he had felt compelled to reinvent himself entirely before seeking refuge in what he had assumed would be St. Mary Mead's peaceful obscurity. The realization that their quiet village had become the final refuge for a man with secrets worth killing forecast the entire investigation in a new light, transforming what had appeared to be a simple crime of passion into something far more complex and dangerous, with implications that extended well beyond the boundaries of their familiar, comfortable world. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green and the investigation entered its most crucial phase, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with her knitting, her mind working through the various threads of evidence and observation that were beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. The killer who had murdered Julian Drake was no rough laborer driven to violence by unpaid wages, but rather someone with the intelligence to plan an elaborate deception, the local knowledge to manipulate village customs and postal services, the domestic instincts to clean and arrange evidence after committing murder, and the calculating ruthlessness to direct suspicion toward an innocent man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong social background to defend himself against sophisticated manipulation. Most significantly, this killer was someone who moved freely within the village's social circles, someone whose presence at crime scenes would be unremarkable and whose access to information about Drake's habits and appointments would be natural and unquestioned. Someone who understood not only the rhythms of St. Mary Mead's daily life, but also the psychology of its residents well enough to predict exactly how they would react to carefully planted evidence and misdirection. And Miss Marple found herself wondering which of her neighbors possessed both the opportunity and the terrible necessity that could drive an otherwise respectable person to such elaborate and calculated violence. The uneasy calm that had settled over St. Mary Mead following Albert Tressida's arrest was shattered on Thursday morning when Hester Rouse was discovered unconscious beside the mill stream, her cleaning basket overturned and its contents scattered along the muddy bank. in a scene that might have been dismissed as a simple accident, if not for the peculiar circumstances surrounding her condition and the revealing nature of what she had been carrying when she fell. Dr. Haydock's examination revealed that while Hester had suffered a severe blow to the head, consistent with striking the stone bridge abutment, her unconscious state seemed more profound than such an injury would typically produce, and her incoherent mumblings about photographs and the lady who telephoned suggested that her accident had occurred while she was in a state of considerable agitation about matters far removed from her usual domestic concerns. Most intriguingly, her scattered belongings included not only the expected cleaning supplies and household items, but also a railway left luggage ticket from Paddington Station dated the previous week, a small bottle of lavender furniture polish that she had apparently decanted into a travel container, and a crumpled envelope bearing a much Benham postmark that contained what appeared to be detailed instructions written in an educated hand about retrieving a parcel and maintaining absolute discretion about the errand. Inspector Craddock's investigation into the left luggage ticket revealed that Hester had indeed collected a small suitcase containing personal effects, including several photographs and documents that painted a very different picture of Julian Drake than the one he had presented to St. Mary Mead, showing him not as a gentleman of leisure seeking rural retirement, but as someone with extensive connections to London's more questionable antique dealers and a history of involvement in transactions that skirted the boundaries of legality. The photographs, when examined by Scotland Yard experts, revealed Drake in the company of individuals known to authorities for their involvement in art forgery and the trafficking of stolen antiquities, while the documents included correspondence that suggested he had been using his residence at the old mill house not merely as a refuge, but as a base for continuing his illicit activities, possibly even planning to target local treasures such as the legendary artifacts rumored to be hidden within St. Mary Mead's ancient parish church. This revelation completely transformed the nature of the investigation, elevating what had appeared to be a simple village murder into something far more complex and dangerous, with implications that extended well beyond the boundaries of their peaceful community, and suggested that Drake's killer might have been motivated not by personal grievance, but by the desperate need to protect themselves from exposure, or to prevent him from carrying out plans that would have brought scandal and ruin upon respectable people who had become entangled in his schemes. Mrs. Carter's behavior became increasingly erratic following news of Hester's accident, particularly when Inspector Craddock mentioned the recovered photographs and documents, causing her to suffer what her niece Lorna described as a severe nervous episode that required Dr. Haydock's attention and left her confined to her room for the remainder of the day, refusing visitors and communicating only through hastily scrawled notes that seemed to bear little resemblance to her usually elegant handwriting. Lorna's growing concern about her aunt's condition led her to confide in Miss Marple that Mrs. Carter had been making mysterious telephone calls at odd hours, speaking in hushed tones about arrangements that must be honored and promises that cannot be broken, while her writing desk now remained locked at all times and emanated the distinctive scent of lavender polish that had become associated with the crime scene at the old mill house. The discovery of Drake's true background also cast new light on several previously overlooked details, including the mysterious antique dealer's van that Mrs. Bantry had observed leaving the old mill house on the afternoon of the murder, which now appeared to have been involved in some form of clandestine exchange rather than innocent furniture delivery, and the sophisticated nature of the false telegram that had delayed discovery of the crime, suggesting a killer with intimate knowledge of both postal procedures and the art world's methods of conducting business through intermediaries and coded communications. Most significantly, the woman's voice that had dictated the telegram from Much Benham was now understood to belong to someone with connections to Drake's illicit activities, someone who possessed both the local knowledge necessary to manipulate village customs and the sophisticated understanding of criminal procedures required to orchestrate such an elaborate deception while directing suspicion toward an innocent man whose only crime had been his presence at the wrong place and time. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green and the investigation entered its most crucial phase, Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting, her mind working through the various threads of evidence that were beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern of desperation, deception, and carefully calculated violence. The killer who had murdered Julian Drake was no simple criminal driven by passion or greed, but rather someone whose respectable facade concealed involvement in activities that would destroy their carefully constructed life if exposed. Someone who possessed both the intelligence to plan an elaborate cover-up and the ruthless determination to eliminate anyone who threatened to reveal their secrets, including poor Hester Rouse, whose loyalty and discretion had ultimately made her too dangerous to survive. The realization that their peaceful village had become the final battleground between a sophisticated criminal and someone equally determined to protect their reputation at any cost filled Miss Marple with a familiar mixture of sadness and resolve that accompanied her most challenging cases, for she understood that the truth, when finally revealed, would shatter more than one carefully maintained illusion and leave St. Mary Mead forever changed by the knowledge of what desperate people would do to preserve the appearances that mattered more to them than human life itself. Miss Marple's decision to invite Mrs. Carter and her niece Lorna for afternoon tea appeared to be nothing more than a neighborly gesture of concern, following the tragic events that had shattered St. Mary Mead's tranquility, but her careful preparation of the sitting room revealed the methodical planning of someone who understood that truth often emerged through the gentle pressure of familiar surroundings rather than the harsh interrogation of official investigations. The tea service was arranged with particular attention to detail, featuring her second-best china alongside a small silver tray bearing lemon slices and sugar cubes, despite her knowledge that neither guest typically took their tea with such additions, while a brass candlestick sat slightly askew on the mantelpiece, its surface bearing the faint residue of what appeared to be furniture polish that had been hastily applied and imperfectly removed. Most significantly, a silver-framed photograph lay face down among the magazines on the occasional table, positioned where it might easily be noticed by observant guests, while the distinctive scent of lavender seemed to permeate the room from sources that were not immediately apparent to the casual visitor. Mrs. Carter arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, her appearance meticulously arranged, to project an image of fragile respectability, despite the telltale signs of strain that careful cosmetics could not entirely conceal, accompanied by Lorna, whose practical competence seemed somewhat diminished by an unusual nervousness that manifested itself in the way her eyes immediately catalogued the room's contents upon entering, noting the telephone's position, the sight lines to various objects, and the careful arrangement of items that suggested deliberate staging rather than casual hospitality. Miss Marple greeted her guests with characteristic warmth while observing their reactions to the room's subtle provocations. Noting how Mrs. Carter's gaze lingered on the brass candlestick with an expression that seemed to combine recognition with barely controlled anxiety, while Lorna's attention was drawn to the overturned photograph with a sort of sharp focus that suggested she understood its potential significance even before its contents were revealed. The conversation began with a sort of gentle inquiries about health and recent distressing events that allowed Miss Marple to gauge her guests' emotional states while gradually introducing topics that carried deeper implications, beginning with sympathetic observations about poor Hester Rouse's accident and her confused mumblings about photographs and telephone calls that had puzzled Dr. Haydock during his examination. Mrs. Carter's response to these seemingly innocent remarks was immediate and revealing, her hands tightening around her teacup while her breathing became noticeably shallow. Reactions that spoke of guilt and fear rather than simple concern for the injured woman, particularly when Miss Marple mentioned the railway ticket and small bottle of lavender polish that had been found among Hester's scattered belongings. The mention of lavender seemed to strike Mrs. Carter with particular force, causing her to emit a small, involuntary gasp. while her eyes darted toward the mantelpiece where the brass candlestick sat in its deliberately imperfect position, its surface still bearing traces of the same distinctive scent that now seemed to emanate from various points throughout the room. When Miss Marple offered cigarettes from a small silver case, explaining apologetically that they were the expensive foreign variety her nephew had insisted she try, Mrs. Carter declined with obvious distaste, but Lorna accepted one with a sort of practiced ease that suggested familiarity with such luxuries, striking the match with unconscious grace while the room briefly filled with the aromatic smoke that Miss Marple had detected lingering in the old Mill House study. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple, with characteristic indirection, began discussing the curious nature of the false telegram that had delayed discovery of the crime, wondering aloud about the woman's voice that had dictated the message from Much Benham with such precise timing and apparent familiarity with postal procedures. Observations that caused Mrs. Carter to set down her teacup with trembling hands, while Lorna's cigarette remained frozen halfway to her lips. The crucial moment arrived when Miss Marple, while tidying the magazines on the occasional table, allowed the silver-framed photograph to slip into view, revealing the determined features of a woman whose strong, intelligent face seemed to command attention even in the confines of the small frame. Mrs. Carter's reaction was immediate and devastating, a soft exclamation of recognition that seemed to escape her lips before she could prevent it, while her eyes fixed on the photograph with an expression of absolute terror that confirmed every suspicion Miss Marple had developed throughout her investigation. Lorna's response was equally telling, though more controlled, as she rose with apparent casualness to straighten the brass candlestick on the mantelpiece, her movements betraying the sort of automatic tidying instinct that compelled her to wipe the surface clean with a folded handkerchief, releasing the distinctive scent of lavender polish that had become associated with the crime scene. The telephone's ring at precisely 4:30 provided the perfect culmination to Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated test, as she answered with the gentle authority that invited confidence while speaking loud enough for her guests to hear Inspector Craddock's report that Hester had regained sufficient consciousness to provide details about the mysterious lady who had given her instructions and the photograph she had been asked to retrieve and conceal. Mrs. Carter's composure collapsed entirely at this news, her face draining of color while her entire body began to shake with the sort of uncontrollable tremors that indicated complete psychological breakdown. And in the terrible silence that followed, Miss Marple observed the final confirmation of guilt in the desperate, cornered expression that transformed her guest's carefully maintained facade into a mask of pure terror. Lorna's growing comprehension was equally apparent as she looked from her aunt's shaking form to Miss Marple's knowing face, the pieces of a puzzle that had tormented her for days, suddenly clicking into place with a horrible clarity that revealed not only her aunt's guilt, but her own unwitting role in concealing evidence and maintaining the deception that had nearly cost an innocent man his freedom. The terrible silence that followed Inspector Craddock's telephone call stretched across Miss Marple's sitting room like a physical presence, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the barely audible sound of Mrs. Carter's increasingly labored breathing as the careful facade she had maintained for days finally began to crumble under the weight of accumulated deceptions. Miss Marple set down the telephone receiver with deliberate gentleness, her mild blue eyes moving between her two guests with the sort of compassionate understanding that acknowledged their shared tragedy while recognizing the necessity of bringing truth into the light, no matter how painful that illumination might prove for all concerned. The silver-framed photograph lay face up on the occasional table now, its subject's determined features seeming to watch the unfolding drama with the sort of knowing expression that suggested secrets could never remain buried forever, while the brass candlestick on the mantelpiece caught the afternoon light in a way that emphasized the faint residue of lavender polish that someone had applied with such meticulous care. When Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice carried the gentle authority that had guided so many previous revelations, beginning not with accusations, but with observations that invited understanding rather than defensiveness. "You see, my dears," she said, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked, "from the very beginning, this tragedy presented us with the most fascinating contradiction between violence and domesticity, between passion and careful planning, between the sort of crime one might expect from desperation and the elaborate deception that followed it." Her eyes rested briefly on the tea service, with its telltale evidence of lemon slices and expensive cigarette ash, before moving to Mrs. Carter's trembling hands. The murder of Mr. Julian Drake was committed by someone young enough and strong enough to strike with fatal force, someone who smoked fashionable cigarettes and wore London lipstick, someone whose presence at the Old Mill House for afternoon tea would occasion no surprise or suspicion from the neighbors who might observe such a visit. The psychological portrait that emerged through Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed the true complexity of the situation, beginning with Drake's real identity as a sophisticated dealer in stolen antiquities who had used his residence at the Old Mill House not merely as a refuge, but as a base for continuing his illicit activities, possibly even planning to target the legendary artifacts rumored to be hidden within St. Mary Mead's ancient parish church. Mrs. Carter's initial correspondence with him had been innocent enough, motivated by her genuine interest in local history and her desire to welcome a cultured newcomer to their community, but Drake had gradually revealed his true nature and the dangerous knowledge he possessed about certain London art dealers and their questionable transactions. Knowledge that included compromising information about Mrs. Carter's late husband's involvement in authenticating pieces that had later proved to be forgeries or stolen goods. The blackmail scheme that followed had been subtle but devastating, with Drake threatening to expose not only the family's past connections to his criminal network, but also to reveal how Mrs. Carter's extensive research into the parish church's historical treasures had unwittingly provided him with the information necessary to plan thefts that would bring scandal and ruin upon the entire village. When Mrs. Carter's attempts to reason with him had failed, when her offers of money had been dismissed with contemptuous laughter, she had turned to her niece Lorna, whose youthful determination and fierce protective instincts had led her to arrange the fatal meeting at the Old Mill House on that terrible Saturday afternoon. Lorna had gone expecting to be charming and firm, offering terms that any reasonable person would accept. But Drake's arrogant dismissal of her threats and his casual mention of bringing certain photographs to the garden party as entertainment for the vicar had driven her beyond the limits of rational behavior. The murder itself had been neither premeditated nor entirely accidental, but rather the desperate act of someone who had been pushed beyond psychological endurance, striking out with a brass candlestick when Drake's mocking laughter made it clear that negotiation was impossible, and that he intended to proceed with plans that would destroy not only her aunt's reputation, but potentially the entire village's peace and security. The elaborate cover-up that followed reflected not criminal cunning, but rather the combined efforts of two women whose different strengths complemented each other perfectly. Lorna's quick thinking in cleaning the evidence and Mrs. Carter's methodical intelligence in orchestrating the false telegram and directing suspicion toward poor Albert Tressida, whose only crime had been his presence at the wrong place and time with the wrong social background to defend himself against sophisticated manipulation. The recruitment of Hester Rouse to retrieve the incriminating photographs had been Mrs. Carter's desperate improvisation, motivated by the realization that Drake's personal effects contained evidence that would expose not only his criminal activities, but also her family's unwitting involvement in providing the research and local knowledge that had made his schemes possible. When Hester's growing understanding of the situation had made her too dangerous to trust with such explosive secrets, the attack by the millstream had been another act of desperation, though one that ultimately failed to prevent the truth from emerging through the very evidence that the two women had worked so hard to conceal. As Inspector Craddock's footsteps approached the cottage door, Miss Marple reached across to take Mrs. Carter's trembling hand in her own, offering the sort of gentle comfort that acknowledged the tragedy of lives destroyed by circumstances that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control, while recognizing that justice, however painful, remained necessary for the restoration of truth and the protection of innocent people like Albert Tressida, who had nearly paid the ultimate price for being convenient scapegoats. The real tragedy, Miss Marple reflected as she prepared to open her door to the inspector's inevitable questions, was not simply that crimes had been committed, but that pride and fear had prevented these two women from seeking help when it might have made a difference, transforming what could have been a manageable problem into a catastrophe that would leave St. Mary Mead forever changed by the knowledge of what desperate people would do to preserve the appearances that mattered more to them than human life itself. The terrible silence that followed Inspector Craddock's telephone call stretched across Miss Marple's sitting room like a physical presence, broken only by Mrs. Carter's increasingly labored breathing as her carefully maintained facade finally crumbled under the weight of accumulated deceptions. Lorna sat frozen in her chair, the expensive cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers as the full implications of Hester's recovered consciousness settled upon her with the inevitability of approaching doom. When Inspector Craddock's familiar footsteps approached the cottage door, Miss Marple rose with deliberate calm to admit him, her mild blue eyes moving between her two guests with a sort of compassionate understanding that acknowledged their shared tragedy, while recognizing the necessity of bringing truth into the light, no matter how painful that illumination might prove for all concerned. "You see, Inspector," Miss Marple began once the formalities of arrival had been observed, her knitting needles clicking softly as she settled back into her chair. "From the very beginning, this tragedy presented us with the most fascinating contradiction between violence and careful domesticity, between the sort of crime one might expect from desperation and the elaborate deception that followed it." Her eyes rested briefly on the tea service with its telltale evidence of lemon slices and expensive cigarette ash, then moved to the brass candlestick on the mantelpiece with its faint residue of lavender polish. The murder of Mr. Julian Drake was committed by someone young enough and strong enough to strike with fatal force, someone who smoked fashionable London cigarettes and wore expensive lipstick, someone whose presence at the old mill house for afternoon tea would occasion no surprise from observant neighbors, and someone whose psychological response to crisis was not flight, but rather the compulsive need to clean and arrange evidence with meticulous domestic care. The psychological portrait that emerged through Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed the true complexity of the situation, beginning with Drake's real identity as a sophisticated dealer in stolen antiquities who had used his correspondence with Mrs. Carter not merely to establish social connections, but to extract detailed information about the parish church's legendary treasures and the village's historical artifacts. Mrs. Carter's extensive research into local history, undertaken with the most innocent scholarly intentions, had unwittingly provided Drake with everything he needed to plan thefts that would bring scandal and ruin upon our entire community. Miss Marple explained, watching as Mrs. Carter's face drained of what little color remained. But more devastating still was his knowledge of her late husband's unwitting involvement in authenticating pieces for London galleries that had later proved to be forgeries or stolen goods. Knowledge that Drake used as the foundation for a blackmail scheme that threatened not only personal disgrace, but the destruction of everything she had worked to build in our village. When Lorna finally found her voice, it carried the desperate honesty that comes only when all hope of concealment has been exhausted. Her account revealing how her fierce protective instincts and youthful confidence had led her to arrange the fatal meeting at the old mill house. "He was utterly contemptuous of our attempts to reason with him," she said, her hands trembling as she described Drake's mocking laughter at her threats and his casual mention of bringing certain compromising photographs to the garden party as entertainment for the vicar. When he turned his back dismissively and reached for those photographs, the ones that would have destroyed Aunt Em entirely, I saw the brass candlestick within reach, and I didn't think, I just reacted to protect her from his cruelty. The fatal blow had been struck not from premeditation, but from the explosive moment when a young woman's love for her family had been pushed beyond the limits of rational behavior by a man who took pleasure in others' suffering. The elaborate cover-up that followed demonstrated the combined intelligence and desperations of two women whose different strengths had complemented each other perfectly in their attempts to escape the consequences of that terrible moment. Mrs. Carter's methodical planning of the false telegram, her choice of Much Benham as the sending location to avoid recognition while ensuring timely delivery, and her systematic direction of suspicion toward Albert Tressida revealed a mind trained in organizational efficiency now applied to criminal deception. The woman's crisp, businesslike voice that dictated the telegram was Mrs. Carter's attempt to disguise her own educated accent, Miss Marple observed, while Lorna's compulsive cleaning of the study with lavender polish reflected the deeply ingrained domestic instincts that made her both an effective conspirator and, ultimately, a detectable one. The attack on Hester Rouse represented their final desperate improvisation when the charwoman's growing understanding of the photograph's significance made her too dangerous to trust with such explosive secrets. As Inspector Craddock absorbed the full scope of their confession, Miss Marple reflected quietly that the real tragedy was not simply that crimes had been committed, but that pride and fear had prevented these two intelligent women from seeking help when it might have made a difference, transforming what could have been a manageable problem into a catastrophe that had nearly destroyed an innocent man and left their peaceful village forever changed by the knowledge of what desperate people would do when cornered by circumstances beyond their control. The weeks that followed the arrest of Lorna Carter and her aunt brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar mixture of relief and unease that settles upon communities when shocking truths have been revealed, and justice, however painful, must take its course. The village resumed its familiar rhythms with determined normalcy, though conversations at the post office and over garden fences carried an undertone of sobered reflection about the depths of desperation that could drive respectable people to such elaborate deceptions. Albert Tressida returned to his modest lodgings with the awkward dignity of a man vindicated but not entirely comfortable with the attention his ordeal had brought, accepting the quiet apologies and small kindnesses of neighbors who had been so ready to believe in his guilt with the philosophical resignation of someone who understood that human nature preferred simple explanations to complicated truths. The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated both the complexity of the case and the tragic circumstances that had transformed two otherwise law-abiding women into desperate conspirators, as Lorna faced charges of manslaughter while Mrs. Carter was held accountable for her role in the elaborate cover-up and the attack on poor Hester Rouse. The courtroom heard testimony that painted a picture of sophisticated blackmail and family loyalty pushed beyond all reasonable limits, with Drake's true identity as a dealer in stolen antiquities providing the context for understanding how scholarly research had been perverted into criminal opportunity, and how the threat of exposure had driven intelligent women to increasingly desperate measures. Lorna's confession, delivered with the exhausted honesty of someone finally unburdened of terrible secrets, revealed the fatal moment when Drake's contemptuous dismissal of their attempts at negotiation had pushed her beyond the boundaries of rational behavior, while Mrs. Carter's methodical planning of the subsequent deception demonstrated how intellectual pride and social position could be corrupted by fear into tools for misdirecting official investigation. Hester Rouse's recovery brought not only relief, but also the final pieces of evidence needed to complete the picture, as her clear recollection of Mrs. Carter's instructions about retrieving the incriminating photographs and the frightening encounter by the mill stream provided confirmation of the desperate lengths to which the two women had gone to protect their secrets. Dr. Haydock's gentle care ensured her comfortable convalescence in a room where the afternoon sun fell kindly, while her sister's devoted attention helped restore both her physical strength and her confidence in speaking the plain truth that had nearly cost her life. The village's response to her ordeal reflected a community's recognition that simple honesty and loyalty, however humble their origins, possessed a moral authority that sophisticated deceptions could never match. The broader implications of the case extended well beyond St. Mary Mead's boundaries, as Scotland Yard's investigation into Drake's criminal network revealed connections to London galleries and to auction houses that had long operated on the margins of legality, dealing in artifacts whose provenance was deliberately obscured and whose authentication often relied on experts who asked few uncomfortable questions. The silver-framed photograph that had served as both talisman and threat to Drake led authorities to a gallery proprietress whose sudden departure for extended health treatments abroad spoke eloquently of guilt and fear, while this systematic examination of Drake's correspondence revealed the sophisticated methods by which he had identified potential targets and extracted the information necessary for his schemes. Mrs. Price Ridley's adjustment to these revelations demonstrated the psychological challenges faced by those whose faith in social hierarchies had been shaken by evidence that respectability could conceal criminal behavior, though her eventual contribution to a subscription for Tressider's lost wages suggested that even the most rigid personalities could adapt when confronted with undeniable evidence of their errors in judgment. Captain Weatherby's military mind struggled more openly with the contradiction between the sophisticated planning required for the cover-up and his preconceptions about feminine psychology. Though his gesture of taking Tressider for a restorative pint at the Red Lion reflected a practical understanding that some wrongs could be partially addressed through simple human kindness. Miss Marple's final reflections on the case, shared during quiet conversations in her garden where the late roses bloomed with stubborn beauty despite the approaching winter, revealed her deep sadness at witnessing how pride and fear had prevented two intelligent women from seeking help when it might have made a difference. "The real tragedy," she observed to Inspector Craddock during one of their thoughtful discussions, "was not the moment of violence that claimed Mr. Drake's life, terrible though that was, but rather the accumulation of small deceptions and desperate choices that transformed what could have been a manageable problem into a catastrophe that destroyed multiple lives and nearly claimed an innocent man's freedom." Her understanding of human nature, refined through decades of quiet observation, recognized that most wickedness began not in malice but in the very human desire to protect what one held dear, and that the path from small convenient untruths to elaborate criminal conspiracies was shorter than good people believed when circumstances pushed ordinary individuals beyond their moral boundaries. As autumn settled over the village and the old mill house stood empty once again, its windows reflecting the changing light with melancholy beauty, St. Mary Mead gradually absorbed the lessons of its recent trauma while maintaining the essential rhythms that had sustained the community through generations of human drama. The parish church's ancient stones continued to guard whatever treasures had attracted Drake's criminal attention, their secrets now safe from the sort of sophisticated schemes that could transform innocent scholarship into tools for theft and blackmail, while the village green resumed its role as the peaceful center of a community that had learned, once again, that the most dangerous mysteries often lay not in dramatic crimes, but in the quiet desperation of ordinary people driven to extraordinary measures by circumstances beyond their control. Miss Marple, tending her garden with the same gentle care she applied to unraveling human puzzles, reflected that truth, once revealed with compassion rather than condemnation, possessed a healing power that could restore both individual souls and community trust, even when that truth illuminated the darkest corners of human weakness and the tragic consequences of pride unchecked by wisdom. The winter months that settled over St. Mary Mead following the conclusion of the Carter case brought with them a peculiar mixture of relief and sobering reflection, as the village gradually absorbed the difficult lessons about human nature that the tragedy had revealed, while working to restore the equilibrium that such shocking events inevitably disturb. The bare branches of the ancient elms cast delicate shadows across the village green, where life resumed its familiar rhythms with a newfound appreciation for the fragility of the trust and mutual respect that made their peaceful existence possible. Albert Tressida returned to his modest cottage with the quiet dignity of a man vindicated but forever changed by his ordeal, accepting the village's belated recognition of his innocence with the philosophical grace that characterized those who understood that human nature preferred simple explanations to complicated truths. Mrs. Bantry's tactfully organized subscription for his lost wages raised more money than expected, reflecting the community's collective desire to make amends for their readiness to believe the worst of someone whose only crime had been insufficient social standing to defend himself against sophisticated manipulation. The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated both the complexity of the case and the tragic circumstances that had transformed two otherwise respectable women into desperate conspirators as Lorna faced charges of manslaughter, while Mrs. Carter was held accountable for her elaborate cover-up and the attack on poor Hester Rouse. The court's recognition of the extraordinary pressures that had driven them to such desperate measures resulted in sentences that acknowledged both the gravity of their crimes and the human circumstances that had pushed them beyond their moral boundaries. Lorna's youth and the protective instincts that had motivated her fatal act earned her a measure of judicial compassion, while Mrs. Carter's methodical orchestration of the subsequent deception brought more severe consequences for someone whose criminal behavior had emerged from pride and fear rather than inherent malice. Hester Rouse's complete recovery brought not only physical healing but also the final pieces of evidence needed to complete the picture, as her clear recollection of Mrs. Carter's instructions and the frightening encounter by the millstream provided crucial testimony, while demonstrating that simple honesty possessed a moral authority that sophisticated deceptions could never match. Her decision to take a lighter position at the Bantry house reflected both practical necessity and a desire for the security that came from working among those who valued loyalty and straightforward dealing above social pretensions. The village's response to her courage in speaking plainly about what she had witnessed reflected a growing appreciation for the fundamental decency that characterized those who earned their living through honest labor. Inspector Craddock's final visits to Miss Marple carried the weight of professional satisfaction tempered by human sadness, as he acknowledged that while justice had been served, the case had revealed the disturbing ease with which ordinary people could be driven to extraordinary measures when circumstances pushed them beyond their psychological limits. His recognition of Miss Marple's crucial role in preventing a terrible miscarriage of justice reinforced his respect for her unique understanding of human psychology and her ability to see through the most carefully constructed deceptions to the truth that lay beneath. The old mill house stood empty through the winter months, its shuttered windows serving as a melancholy reminder of the violence that had briefly shattered their peace, until a retired schoolmistress with a passion for botany took it for a modest rent and gradually transformed it from a monument to tragedy into a symbol of renewal and hope. Her engagement of Tressida to restore the mill wheel to working order provided both practical employment and symbolic healing, as the gentle sound of turning water once again brought life to a place that had known only death and deception. Miss Marple's final reflections on the case, shared during quiet conversations in her garden where the late winter roses showed the first signs of new growth, revealed her deep understanding of how good people could be corrupted by circumstances while maintaining their fundamental capacity for redemption through honest acknowledgement of their failures. The real tragedy, she observed to Dr. Haydock during one of their thoughtful discussions, was not the moment of violence that had claimed Julian Drake's life, terrible though that was, but rather the accumulation of small deceptions and increasingly desperate choices that had transformed what could have been a manageable problem into a catastrophe, affecting multiple lives. As spring returned to St. Mary Mead and new life emerged in gardens that had endured winter's harsh testing, the village gradually resumed its essential character, while retaining the hard-won wisdom that came from witnessing how quickly ordinary circumstances could become extraordinary when pride and fear overrode the simple moral principles that provided the only reliable guide through life's inevitable crises. The parish church's ancient stones continued to guard whatever treasures had attracted Drake's criminal attention, their secrets now safe from the sort of sophisticated schemes that could transform innocent scholarship into tools for theft and blackmail. Miss Marple, tending her garden with the same gentle care she applied to understanding human nature, reflected that the most valuable lessons often emerged from the most painful experiences, and that communities, like individuals, could emerge stronger from their encounters with tragedy if they faced truth with courage rather than seeking comfort in convenient deceptions. The guest who never came had left behind more than a mystery solved. He had provided St. Mary Mead with a deeper understanding of both human weakness and the resilience that allowed good people to learn, forgive, and continue building lives worthy of the trust they placed in one another.